Welcome to Text Readings with Greg Stafford, where we progressively work our way through the ancient biblical records. We also at times consider other related texts and histories because our interest is in the Bible and what it has to say from a historical and religious perspective. If you've been with me through to this point, then you know we're in the book of Exodus. We're going in according to the translations I've done to date, both from the Greek and Hebrew texts, but I have not done all of them. So we skip around a little bit according to what I have done. And now we're in Exodus chapter 6. Previously, we covered parts of Exodus such as chapter 3, where God revealed his name to Moses in a special way. We're going to go back to that a little bit, but first let's get to our primary reading. Exodus chapter 6. We're only going to consider 3 verses today, but because we do the Greek and Hebrew, when we have those translations of those texts available, it's really 6 texts. And then we're going to discuss other related texts, and then we'll wrap it up and make sure that the point that we read about is stressed so that we remember it. Exodus chapter 6, verse 1. You can follow along with me in your translation of the Bible. Again, I use my own because it's what I know best. At times, I also use what I know best, and that is the New World Translation, as well as other translations where they fit the discussion. So let's talk about it. Exodus chapter 6, verse 1, Hebrew translation. Then Jaho began to say to Moses, "Now you will see what I will cause to occur respecting Pharaoh, because by a strong hand he will send them away, and he will with a strong hand even throw them out," the Hebrews, of his land. Verse 1, Greek translation. Then Lord Jaho said to Moses, "Now you will see what things I will do to Pharaoh, for by a strong hand he will send them away, and with a raised hand he will drive them out of his land." Verse 2, Hebrew translation. Again God began to speak to Moses, and he said to him, "I am Jaho." Verse 2, Greek translation. Now God spoke to Moses again and said to him, "I am Lord Jaho." Verse 3, Hebrew translation. In the past, this is Jaho continuing to speak to Moses. Our last text of our text reading, and then we'll talk more about it. Jaho saying, continuing to Moses, in the past, I would appear to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But I had not caused my name, Jaho, to be completely understood by them. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Verse 3, Greek translation of what Jaho was continuing to say to Moses. After he said in verse 2, I am Lord Jaho. Verse 3, and I was revealed to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob as the one who is their God. But my name, Lord Jaho, I did not fully explain or make clear to them. So what does Jaho mean by that? What does he mean by I appeared to them as their God or as God Almighty, but he didn't make completely understandable to them his name or fully explain, make clear to them his name? Well, we know, according to texts involving people like Abraham, for example, Genesis 12:13, that he did call upon the name of Jaho. So he had to have known the name, right? Of course. It says he built an altar to Jaho and began calling on the name of Jaho who had appeared to him. We'll go back to some of those texts and discuss them further in a moment. But if that's the case, so what is Jaho explaining here? How is it that people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who knew his name, right? They knew the name, they used the name, they worshiped Jaho. How is it then that he did not make his name completely understood by those, or clear to those, or explain to those who were worshiping him? What is that? Well, let's take a look at a couple texts. The first being in Genesis. So I've already mentioned a couple of times, right, where in Genesis chapter 12 and 13, for example, you have Moses building an altar to Jaho. I'll just go ahead and pull up a couple of those because I've read the account so many times. I know pretty much where they are. And so here's where Jaho appeared to him, tells him these things. Then he built an altar there to Jehovah and began to call on the name of Jehovah. So Genesis 12:8 says he built an altar to Jehovah and began to call on the name of Jehovah. Here in Exodus 6:3 it says he appeared to Abraham, just like we read, but he didn't. His name wasn't fully made known to them. Okay, so we know based on what we just read in Genesis about what Abraham did, building an altar to and calling on the name of Jehovah. He knew the name. There are multiple other texts I could show, and if you read Genesis 12 and 13 and onward, you'll see that's the case. It's not about not knowing the name. Okay, so that's clear. So what did he not fully explain? What was not made fully known to them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is being made known to Moses and the Hebrews? Let's take a look at one other text in Genesis. And then let's see if I can find, there should be another. There's multiple places, as I said, you'll see in here where he responds to Jaho, or Jaho, for example, before the Hebrews are released from Egypt as slaves. It's interesting how, in a prefiguring sense, Abraham and Sarah go into Egypt and they leave after, Pharaoh is a different kind of Pharaoh, right? He's not mistreating them. They just are taken aback by Sarah's beauty. So Abraham kind of deceives them so that they don't abuse him to get to her. But then, of course, it turns around on them, and that Pharaoh listens to Jaho, the signs through the plagues he's receiving, and he sends them out, right? Sends Abraham and Sarah out and all their possessions, gives them more possessions. It's kind of a prefiguring of what you see happening with his seed later on. But it is not what happens to his seed later on, nor what Jaho promised Abraham. Genesis 17. So how is it different? How is it that they knew the name, right? They know the name. So they're walking around using the name. Jaho, you can look it up in any concordance. You'll see it there numerous times in Genesis, used by the very people. Jaho says to Moses, that they didn't know or fully know his name, right? They knew the name, but they didn't fully know. It wasn't made known in the same way it's being made known here. So let's explore that further for a moment. Genesis 17, here we are. It's Jaho speaking again to Abraham, or Abram. I may refer to them interchangeably because of the overlapping context and some of my references. But here it says, he talks about making him very fruitful, right? His name will not be Abram anymore. I will carry out my covenant between you, your seed, according to their generation. Right? Who's he? He's talking about the Hebrews that we're reading about in Exodus 6, 1 through 3. Right? All this stuff that's happening with Moses, the Hebrews, the seed through Joseph, Jacob, Abraham, the one we're reading about right here. that Jehovah is speaking about, or speaking to, about his seed. Then in verse 8, look at what he says. I will give to you and to your seed after you the land of your alien residences, and even the entire land of Canaan, for a possession to time indefinite, and I will prove myself God to them. Not God to you, God to them. In the context of their what? Taking possession of the land, the entire land of Canaan, for a possession to time indefinite. And he will, in that way, prove himself God to them. So, this is very important because it shows a difference in the way Jehovah is going to be with his seed after Abraham. It's going to be in a different way that he's telling him about here, right? He's telling him about it right here. I'll make you very fruitful. You'll become many nations. Become nations. Kings will come out of you. My covenant between me and your seed after you to their generations for a covenant to time indefinite, to prove myself God to you and to your seed after you, right? So there, of course, he's speaking to Abraham and he's proving him. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about here when they take possession of the land of Canaan to time indefinite. That's when he specifies that he'll be God to them. Not to Abraham and to his seed in relation to the covenant he's making with Abraham. Obviously, that's between Abraham, that's the me, or that's Yahweh, you and your seed. So Abraham and those after him. The covenant expands from that. But this part, this fulfillment of their taking the land, which is happening or going to happen after what we read, right? They have to be freed first. This is Jehovah becoming to the Hebrews what he said to Abraham he would be. I will prove myself God to them so that they take possession of the land. Well, to do that, he's got to get them out of Egypt, right? So I'm establishing in Genesis the difference made between the covenant between Abraham and his seed and the way he would prove to be God to them in verse 8 as they take possession, or as part of their taking possession of the land, which begins by them recognizing him as what? God. I will prove myself God to them. Let's go to Exodus chapter 3. And see how it reads when God first started speaking to Moses in this way. We've already done a video on it, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but let's take a look, right? So we just read in Genesis how we know Abraham knew Jehovah's name. He built an altar, sacrificed to it, called on it. We know that God made a covenant with Abraham and his seed to time indefinite, and that he would become God to his seed in a way that was obviously different from Abraham because it involved taking possession of the land to time indefinite. And so when Moses became a shepherd of the flock of Jethro, we read about it. Jehovah's angel appeared to him in the flame of fire, just like we read about in Hebrews 1, as we're discussing in our Bible and the Trinity and Conflict series. And so here's where Jehovah, through his angel, reveals himself to Moses in this special way, right? We talked about it in Exodus 6, our reading, right? Let me pull that up real quick. He starts telling Moses, you're going to find out what's going to happen with Pharaoh, right? You're going to see what's going to happen. This is what I'm going to do. I am Jehovah. In the past, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. But there's something they didn't realize. I didn't explain to them. They didn't fully understand. Like you will. Like they will. And so, taking that in hand, he talks about how he's seen. He says, what? First to Moses, Exodus 3:6. Good way to remember this is what? Reverse of Exodus 6:3. So when you think Exodus 6:3, think Exodus 3:6. Because there it says, and he went on to say, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Then Moses concealed his face because he was afraid to look at the true God, or at God. So this shows the connection all the way through from Genesis and God involved with Abraham, following texts involving Isaac and Jacob. Now through to Moses. We all know they knew his name, but we're reading something about it here that is a fulfillment of what he promised to Abraham, specifically in Genesis 17:8, about becoming God to these people, this part of his seed who is going to take possession of the land. Because look, unquestionably I've seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. And so he says, I'm going down there to bring them up into a new land, the same land he told Abraham his seed would take possession of to time indefinite. This is it. This is the fulfillment of that promise, that part of the promise to Abraham, the first part of it, right? They're being freed from this condition, which is so different from what he promised, right? To the locality of the Canaanites and the entire land of Canaan, as we read. And so he goes on to tell Moses what to say, right? We read about it. And then Moses kind of hesitates several times, in fact, even though he's seen this miracle. And we talked about how that's more contextually explainable and relatable, because Moses has been in Egypt pretty much his whole life. So gods, the power of the gods, that's not brand new to him. While this appearance was certainly spectacular, right? He bows down, he worships Jehovah through the angel. There's still a task at hand that's pretty grand, right? Think of what it would be like for you if you were told by a convincing, Jehovah representative power to go into, for example, this is an example only, the Kremlin in Russia, and make demands about Christians and their treatment in Russia, right? I'm not saying all Christians are mistreated in Russia. I'm not speaking on that. This is an example only. You could switch out any country. I'm using Russia because it represents one of the greatest difficulties, right, that you would face in walking into a place like that and making demands, even if you felt you had a strong hand, Jehovah, behind you. I don't think it would be easy no matter what. And so I think it's more contextually relatable when we look at it in some sense, how it might be right now. Nonetheless, he goes on to tell him, I'm the God of Abraham, their forefathers, Jehovah. This is my name to time indefinite, my memorial, the memorial of me. He gives them a sign that he will be with Moses. In verse 12, after Moses says in verse 11, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring your people out?" Verse 12, he says, "Because I will be with you. This is the sign for you. It is I who have sent you." This is the sign. This is the same term used here twice. Ehye. I will be with you, or I will be. I will be with you, and this is the sign for you. After you've brought the people out of Egypt, you people will serve God on this mountaintop. So he's going to bring them out of Egypt, right? That's what he's telling them. Moses says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and tell him I'm bringing your people out?" Jehovah says, "Because I will be with you." That's the sign that it is I who have sent you, that after you've brought them out, right? Jehovah is basically what? He's already beyond what Moses is asking about. Moses is asking him, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I have to bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? Jehovah says, because I will be with you, and this is the sign that is I have sent you. After you've done what you just asked me about, right? He doesn't even address the despair Moses is really, asking in his question. Who am I that I'm going to go to Pharaoh and tell him, send your people out? Jehovah responds by telling him, look, after you've done that, you see what I'm saying? After you've done that, you're going to worship me on this mountain. Where you're right now, they're all going to be around. So what are you talking about? That's why he goes on to get a little angry with Moses. A lot angry, right? Because Moses continues to doubt. Whereas when Jaho is talking, right? When you have the confidence in the faith like Jaho does, which Moses was lacking, and we sometimes do too, you're already past these difficulties. You've already done them because you know you're with Jaho. In this case, that's the whole point. I will be with you. If you don't believe Jaho is with you, I don't know how you can do anything really that involves talking about him or faith. But there are degrees, right? There are moments of testing that really show whether you believe Jaho is with you or no. So far with Moses, it's what? It's no. At least right here, right? We're in Exodus 6, but we're relating it back to what? The explanation Moses gave, that Jaho gave to Moses, that's more than what he declared or made explained to Moses. And that's happening right here, versus in a promise through Abraham for his seed. So after he says that, Moses goes on to do what I just mentioned, question further, asks about his name. Jaho, he asks two things, right? He says, what is his name and what shall he say to them? So Jaho repeats what he says in verse 12. The same thing, he doubles it up. Ehya asher ehya. I will be who I will be. Just like I told you in verse 12. I will be with you. And once you've completed what you're questioning me about, you're going to worship on this mountain. It's all going to happen. I'm going to bring it about. All of it. The promise I made to your father, the one I was just telling you about earlier. When I appeared right here in verse 6. I'm here to fulfill that promise. And once I fulfill it, you're going to be right here with all the people. So Moses asked him further, the name and what he'll say to them, even though he just told them. He goes on to repeat it right here. This is what you say. I will be has sent me to you. I am the one who will be to you these things. I will be with you, Moses, and I will be with you, the people, the ones I'm going to free. This is what you say to the sons of Israel. Same thing I'm telling you, Moses, you tell them. And then he goes on to say what? This is what you're to say to the sons of Israel. Jehovah, the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, this is my name. He does not attach this is my name to Exodus 3:14. Now, in terms of the fuller explanation, the making known of his name and the connection that many people make in terms of the verb ehya and the way they pronounce the divine name Yahweh. So they see it as like a third person occurrence of the verb that's in the first person in verses 12 and 13. I will be, he will be. They look at connections that they come up with like that, and they try to say that that's how we know to pronounce the name Yahweh. Of course, it fits none of the linguistic phonetic evidence that we have in the transliterations attributed to the Jews, right? Ever, right? Even the transliterations that we get in the second, third, and following centuries and later centuries of our common era, right? Not BC, not before Jesus. Those are attributed to the Samaritans, not the Jews, and it's in contrast to what? Jah. The same name that Moses uses where? Just a few chapters later in Exodus 15, 17, we'll get to in a minute. A name that in no way relates to any obvious connection with the form of the verb used here, ehye. So, whereas with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and anywhere in Genesis, we don't get the use of Jah as a standalone name. We get it with Moses, right? Jahuah not only explains further in what way he's going to fulfill the promise made to Abraham that he's God to them, that this is how they're going to know who he is, all of which are associations that become attributable to the name, as I wrote in my second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defended. Well, I'm going to bring that up just real quick because I believe there's a part there we can read. And while I bring that up, we'll just continue to make this connection. So, again, Moses uses Jah in Exodus 15 and 17. In fact, while I bring that up, I'll do that. Let that come up. We'll put that here for now. And then let me bring you guys back up for a little Exodus 15 and 17. Let's go ahead and jump there because, again, there's a lot going on here in Exodus 3 and in the following chapters that show Moses becomes aware of Yahuwah in a new way that's the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, because Yahuwah is actually with him, going to be with him and with the Hebrews when he frees them. And so in that way, his being with them and becoming their deliverer, as promised through Abraham, the one who would bring them into the new land of Canaan, become attached to his name. Whether or not the name is related etymologically to the verb ehya, I will become. The divine name does not have to be related to that verb to have the associations of that verb as part of its meaning. Right? Otherwise, you not only, I'll get to additional examples in a moment and explain further what I mean by the associations and descriptions of a person becoming the meaning of the person's name. And unless there's corroborating evidence that would show that the pronunciation was Yahweh in a way that would allow for that kind of relationship etymologically, and there isn't, right? I just mentioned the Greek transliterated evidence that we get shows Yah-O and Yah, and other forms that until you get into the several centuries into our common era, you don't have anything like Yahweh. You don't have any transliterations of, for example, into Greek, the Hebrew Aramaic names ending in "eh." You get some unusual forms just because of the transliteration and the phonetic differences between Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek at times. So I'm not saying that in terms of like all names with theophoric suffixes have to match their Hebrew, Aramaic counterparts phonetically. But they don't represent a pronunciation of a theophoric suffix containing the final part of the divine name as eh. They're all ah. And the transliterations of the divine name represent a form that is different from Yahweh. And that form, when we do get to it, is not even attributed to the Jews, but to the Samaritans in contrast to the Jews. I went over a lot of this in my Why Jah video, but it's relevant here, right? Because Moses is the one who introduces Jah, Yah. He doesn't just get made known to him these additional descriptions and meaningful relationships between the promise made to Abraham, right? The one he said to Moses, I am Abraham's God, Isaac's God, Jacob's God. I'm that God. I'm here to you now to do what I promised. And I'm going to be God to these people. I'm going to be God with you. I'm going to be with you. And I'm going to be with them. And you're going to know. It's not even going to be a question. You're going to, once I've already done what you're asking about, you're going to be on this mountaintop. That's what Yahuwah is trying to tell Moses. And that's what becomes associated with the meaning of his name. So, of course, Exodus 3:14, the time when Yahuwah doubles up what he tells Moses in verse 12, will be true with respect to the people, so that the thing he keeps asking him about won't need to be further explained, because just like right now, he's going to be with them, the ones who Moses thinks are going to be asking these things. So, Yahuwah is now at that point where he has made it clear to Moses in those ways. He doubles up what he told him in verse 12 and verse 14. And to me, it's very clear that that's what he's trying to explain. That I am with you and I will be with them, and that's how they're going to know. just like I explained in my text reading video on Exodus 3, 1 through 15. And so let's move forward. Now, a similar thing I should point out, in Exodus 6:3, right here, where it says in the Hebrew, completely understood, and in the Greek, fully explained. So in the Greek text, I moved away from that. I jumped over to Genesis, but I can get there quickly. Either way, in the Hebrew text, it's the term yada. And so it's the same term used in Exodus 7:5. Let's go there quickly since we're right next to it. Where it says, after Jaho, he's talking about what, we're going to get to this reading. Our next text reading is going to be Exodus chapter 7. This is part of it. Where he says he's going to make Moses God to Pharaoh and Aaron his prophet. And then in verse 5 he says, and the Egyptians will certainly know, yada, that I am Jehovah when I stretch out my hand against Egypt. And I shall indeed bring the sons of Israel out of their midst. Now, before Jahoah actually stretches out his hand against Egypt, right? Moses comes in, and if they didn't know Jahoah already from the worship, from the Hebrews and their connection to Abraham and the promises made and their different generations, I'm sure it's likely Pharaoh knew or had heard of Jahoah. I didn't know him, not in the way that he's going to, right? Because right here in verse 5, even though Moses walks in and tells him, that this is what Jahoah said, he doesn't know yada, Jahoah, until Jahoah stretches out his hand. In fact, even Pharaoh says, I don't know him. I'm not going to send them away. So it's not about knowing the name. Just like I explained when we were talking about Genesis and Abraham knowing the name, obviously he called on it, right? But he didn't know in the real sense that the fulfillment of the things that he was being told about taking possession of the land of Canaan, that his seed would accomplish that. And then the same thing here with Pharaoh, right? He didn't know, Abraham didn't know Jahoah in the way that they will now. And Pharaoh did not know Jahoah at first the way he comes to know Jahoah at the end, right? Or during the time when he's stretching out his hand. So it's about experiencing the actual presence of Jahoah with you. That's what he tells Moses, right? I will be with you. What does he tell Moses to tell the people? I will be who I will be. The exact thing he told him in verse 12, twice, right? And then Moses goes on, so it's like a progression in the dialogue that leads to this emphasizing of what? The same thing twice in relation to the people that Moses is speaking on behalf of. And effectively, they're both doubting, right? Because Moses is speaking for them and he's doubting. So Jahoah is dealing with all this doubt, trying to make clear to them that they're going to find out. And Moses knows right now, right? I am with you. I will be with you. It's happening now and it's going to continue. This is it. This isn't just a promise I'm telling you and then you tell your seed and then, eventually these things will happen. We're here. This is the day. This is the time. We're going, right? It's now. And so now if we jump down after we go a little ahead, like I was saying, Exodus 15, we get to the first occurrences of Yah, by the very one who not only had made known to him in this emphasized way the special association of Jah's presence and his being with those he's saying are going to accomplish different things in his name, and that's how they'll know that he's with them. All of these things then become a part of their understanding of Jahoah. There's no evidence that it's due to a verbal association. Not with Abraham, right? There's no indication that Abraham saw it in that way. And there's no indication that that's how Moses understood it. Jahoah has to go out of his way to re-emphasize the way in which they will know he's with them, that these things are really going to happen, regardless of their depressed, enslaved state, right? A state in which they're not likely to respond without some answers. That's why Moses is talking like this. And that's why Yahweh reassures him the way he does. I'm going to be with you. Right? I'm not just sending you all along and you're going to be all alone. And as we've read in our text readings, he goes on to give him powers, abilities, people to speak for him. And so Yahweh this is the time he's going to use Moses, or if Moses can't get it right, then he does have Aaron, but already we're with Moses in the way that works in the course of Yahweh's preparation of these people, right? The fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, that he would be God to them. So after that, in fact, takes place, Exodus 15, what? They start singing to Jehovah. They start singing to Jah. They start singing to God, but they start using this new form of the name with no association whatsoever to any kind of to any use of Ehyeh in that way. And it's not just, it's used in many other texts. For example, if we come into Exodus 17, where it says the entire assembly of the sons of Israel proceeded to depart from the wilderness of sin by stages, they took, according to the order of Jehovah, and went into their encampments. And then it goes on, let's see, where they get to the point and they use a form of the name of Jah with regard to his throne. Right here in verse 16, Moses proceeded to build an altar just like Abraham and to call its name Jehovah Nishi. Mine's a little distorted because my conversion replaces certain vowels and consonants, so my apologies. But in verse 16, saying, because a hand is against the throne of Jah, Jehovah will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So this is not a song. It's not always used in a song. Moses uses the form of the name Jah, being the one to whom a more complete explanation was declared or made about God's name. And so we not only get after that forms of the name in not only three-letter forms like Yod He Wah, but also in Greek transliterations, Yah, O, Yah. We don't get a transliteration consistent with Yahweh. So after the name is not only used by people like Abraham all the way through to Jacob and their seed after them, and Moses is appeared to by Yahweh and has his name explained more to him, we don't get anything that would suggest Yahweh. We get all of the verbal associations from Ehyeh because it's used to explain in response to Moses how Yahweh is going to do these things. But there's nothing other than people's imagination etymologically that makes them think Yahweh is similar to Ehyeh, and so they must be the same. They must be related to the same verb etymologically. Okay. No. If that was the case, then it's likely we would have some association of Jah with Ehyeh somewhere, right? No, we don't get that anywhere. And we would likely have had at least one, right? At least one transliteration in Greek that supports Yahweh. We don't. Nowhere in the history of the Jewish use of divine names for God in Greek transliterations, phonetic names for God, pronounceable names, do we get Yahweh. So it just doesn't hold up. And we don't need that verbal association to believe the associations of the verbs used in verses 12, 14 for Jehovah, Yahuwah, or even Jah. Right? Should we not associate with Jah the very same things? I do. Why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't Moses? You don't think Moses, using Jah in Exodus 15 and 17, believed that Jah and in using that name, included all of the things that he just told him his name, even the fuller form of it, represented. All the things that also took place that he actually made happen just like he promised through Abraham. Of course. I don't see any difference between the associations or meanings of the name, whether it's Jah or Jahoah. They mean the same thing to me because they're for the same God. They're just a form of the same name of the same God. And I want to share with you an item from my text edition here. I'll go ahead and bring it up so we're kind of on the same page a little bit. And how do I want to do this? So let me bring this up. The first chapter is really kind of a book in itself, as many of you know, right, on the divine name. But there's a section, I'll try to get to it briefly here while we kind of discuss things. There's a section in which I quote what I believe is a good representation of what I'm talking about in terms of the associations of a person's, or in this case, God's name, coming not from the verbal relationship of the name with another verb or form of the related verb, but because of the uses of verbs and other descriptions in association with that name, regardless of whether it's connected etymologically. So, we'll go ahead and review that together. And then we'll wrap this up. But I want to make it clear that in this case, we do have both a fuller explanation of the name, do we not? Right? In terms of emphasizing how he's going to prove to be God with them, the same thing he told Abraham he would become to his seed in Genesis 17:8. So he's telling Moses that. Moses is like, what? Okay, well, so what am I supposed to say? I already told you. So again, I will be who I will be. This is what you tell them. This is what's going to happen. This is my name to time indefinite, my memorial. All of these things. There's nothing that makes any kind of verbal connection clear. Not anywhere in the context. Right? The Septuagint doesn't necessarily show an association, although it's a little bit different type of reading. So you might try to show a relationship, obviously, with Asamai and Ha'on, but still, there's a different concept there, and it's still their associations of the name. They are related, right? It's just like Exodus 12 uses the same verb as Exodus 3:14 in the Hebrew, right? Ehyeh. So the fact that Asamai shows a relationship with Ha'on isn't a big surprise. It's just that in Exodus 3:14, Ha'on is used in a way that conveys a more present aspect of what God is becoming. Whereas in verse 12, it emphasizes more the future aspect of God, what God will be. But I'm going to argue that verse 14 still includes that. In particular, by its association with verse 12. So that doesn't change anything, is what I'm saying. That is to be expected, the relationship between those verbs, just like the same verbs are used in the Hebrew. The question is, does that mean the divine name is pronounced in association with its etymological relationship with Ehyeh? There's nothing that shows that, nothing that indicates that. And so I say no. But it doesn't lose, this is what's important to remember, it doesn't lose the verbal associations conveyed by Ehyeh or Ha'on in the Greek text. Right? Those are all a part of what Jahoah is telling him he is and will be and what his name represents. That does not require the name to be related to the same verb the way that many Yahweh pronouncers like to argue. So, I'm going to jump down here though and just get us to the point where I can share with you the one quote that I was talking about. Okay, so I think we're pretty much here. We're getting close. I have so many good quotes here, so it's easy. And I thought of sharing this kind of after I started, so bear with me. But as I go through this, as you can see, here's the start of the chart. What is this on page 39? This is my third edition. So here you can see the different forms that I've established were used at different times in relation to the biblical periods during which the people of Jahoah would have been familiar with his name, or others like Diodorus, right, would have been familiar with it because of hearing all these Jews pronouncing the name of God in these different ways. And so none of them represent or provide evidence to show that the Jews were pronouncing God's name as Yahweh to show a relationship with Ehyeh etymologically, right? There's nothing that shows that other than people believing it's true. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference. You can believe something's true and not have any evidence. Or you can believe the evidence. Now they'll say, well, look at how similar they are and how, if we look at this as the first person, third person, that's not evidence. That's you proposing something that is similar visually and phonetically, but it does not represent the phonetic evidence that we have to establish the pronunciation pattern that should at least include something like what you're arguing for, if that's the fact, if that's the case. And then we have the use of Yah, Jah, which doesn't ever is never argued for as having an etymological relationship to Ehyeh. But yet that doesn't change, right? Does it? Does that change the fact that we still associate Jah with what? Exodus 3:14. So if it doesn't change that with respect to Jah, why would that change it with respect to Jahoah, or the full form of the name? We don't need to come up with an etymological view that involves a pronunciation that flies in the face of all the best historical evidence when it doesn't change anything as far as the verbal associations presented in those texts. In this case, specifically Exodus 3:12, 14, and the other descriptions that are given in that context where Jahoah is really explaining, right? He's fully making known in these more emphatic and descriptive ways how he is to be made known to the Hebrews, which is different than the extent to which he had to go into and did go into with people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the revelation of Jahoah to those three patriarchs did not involve, as far as we know, the use of Jah, Yah, used by Moses. Not too long after this context involving Jahoah's appearance to him, right? After they leave Exodus. So obviously he knew that name somewhere pretty quick, and it could very well be that that's a part of this more complete explanation of his name in a way that he took away from it, at least, not only the verbal associations used in the context, but the different forms of the name that then became an actual part of the Jewish history of the text and the Christian text, right? Because Revelation 19 uses what? Hallelujah. And that was a separate expression and a separate name until it later became consolidated into one expression. By whom? The later Christians, right? And so they, in one way, Jahoah maybe fooled them and preserved his name without them realizing it. Either way, they've lost connection with that name. Hopefully they'll get it again. Seems like some of them are trying. But that name is the one in the text, right? We know Yah is used in the biblical text, Old and New. We have good reasons to believe that the full form of the name, or at least Yah-O, biblical forms of the name pronounced according to the Jews and others who wrote how they pronounced it in the texts that are quoted in the New Testament where it's found in the Old Testament. But as far as the associations and the things that I wanted to say, so we're kind of scrolling through my my divine name translation. You can get this whole chapter online in my topical index on Elihu books as well, by the way. The link is in the description below. But I want to get to, if I can, I probably should have had this ready though, right? But this is extra stuff, things for us to consider. And I want to just read this if I can find it, because I believe it represents best, which is why I quoted it, what I'm talking about when it comes to not having to have I'm actually kind of just reading. And and looking, so it's probably not fair. But okay, let's read this. Most names change to some extent when transferred from one language to another. Jesus was born a Jew, and his name in Hebrew was perhaps pronounced Yeshua. But the inspired writers of the Christian scriptures did not hesitate to use the Greek form of the name Jesus. I think I'm quoting NWT here. Let me see. Reasoning from the scriptures. Okay. That's why it sounded a little familiar in terms of the kind of introduction to the pronunciation of the name part I was getting to. But that's not what I was looking for. So let's continue, right? And so I hope I was able to at least make clear the difference between the use of the name by Abraham, for example, and Isaac or Jacob, because they knew the name, right? We proved that. We established that. The text shows that. But there's a sense in which Exodus 3, right, our last text in our text reading, is making plain that Jaho revealed something about his name to Moses. That is more. It's a more clear explanation of his name, made both by the verbal associations involving his presence with Moses, his being with Moses, and what he's supposed to tell the people. Same thing. And then this use of Jah or Yah by Moses right after he gets this full explanation of the name. And so, and then of course, as we know, I talked about it a moment ago in Revelation 19, that's the name which all living things are going to use when we praise the God of the Bible. Right? It specifies that name, a name that was known and used during the time period when the events in the first century were happening. It's what I established in my Why Jah video, and which we can see evidenced in the use of Yah in Revelation 19. So again, the evidence does not support Yahweh. Right? We do not get transliterations phonetically during any of the biblical periods or in any part of biblical names. And we get forms of the name given or made more clear to Moses like Yah or Jah that also have contextually, by their usage, right? Many people, because of the association usage of the divine name in Exodus 3 and Ehyeh and the way that Yahweh uses it to Moses, they make the connection more because of that. But there's no connection made like that with Yah. I'm going to argue it's still connected with it, right? Not because of the verbal, etymological, potential association relationship, but because that's what's true of that God. And that's his name, so it's true of him, and therefore also his name. So, as you know, if you've read this chapter, there's quite a bit of information to go through. And here we're talking about Yahweh, it's coming in, but I want to see if I can get to that one part. If not, then I don't think it's necessary because I've talked about it. Now, here it is. Okay, we did get to it. I thought I might, right? It's in the section, The Meaning of God's Name. It's like page 136. So it's like over 100 pages into the chapter, as I said. And maybe one day I will break this up into a separate book about the divine name. I could do all those things, but right now I need to finish certain projects that are already in place. I need to keep reinforcing the teaching that the best evidence points to Jesus as the pre-Christian Messiah foretold in all these texts, and then also promote the worship of the one God Yahuwah, right? The evidence we have that shows how we can pronounce his name in ways that are not controversial, not as controversial as Yahweh. And so in that light, listen to what this writer has to say, because it relates to what I've been talking about in terms of the verbal associations and descriptions used in a particular context, like Exodus 3, where God's name is revealed and made known. It shows how they become a part of the name no matter what. And so, without any other indication that Ehyeh and the verbs used like that in verse 12 of Hebrews 3 and twice in Hebrews 3:14 for describing how God will be with the people, how they'll know he's with them. you don't need to see it as etymologically related in order to achieve the same thing. So there's just no reason, no compelling reason beyond that suggestion, really, to do so. And it creates a lot of difficulty that I think we can avoid if we just go with Jah, right? It's undisputable, indisputable. The Jews don't dispute it. Christians don't really dispute it, other than to use it or not, right? And it's not even forbidden by the Jews to use in the same way that the Tetragrammaton is. It is limited in some respects, prayer, study, but it's not forbidden in the same way that the Tetragrammaton becomes forbidden. And so let me get to the quotation I wanted to kind of wrap things up with. As far as this section, and it's good that we got to it because it also goes into more of what I've been talking about. And whether or not the divine name, as asked right here, means who is and who shall be, because it's derived from the same verb used, echye, in Exodus 3:14. And so let's read this quote first, which is from Harris's The Pronunciation of the Tetragram. You can see the full details in my notes and bibliography that are available online. As I mentioned, my topical index for this section of my third edition under J. So Harris states, the writer of this article, The Pronunciation of the Tetragram, which I quote several times in this chapter, why base anything? This is not the one I was looking for, but it's one we'll use right before it, and then we'll wrap things up with the one that I believe best represents what I've been talking about in terms of how you can get the same sense of the meaning of God's name from everything that's said about him without having to look for an etymological relationship that's not otherwise made plain. Like because his name means. In some texts we do get this kind of very specific explanation of the meaning of a name in relation to another term or verb. And so Harris states here, why base anything on the expression I will be what I will be, whether it is he full or call or imperfect or participle, as some have suggested. We'll skip past the grammatical stuff. I don't want to make this too heavy for people. Just know he's dealing with the grammatical stuff. He's considering the grammatical arguments like I have, and this is what he has to say. You can read the rest on your own time if you want to see more about what he's saying here means and how he's explaining it. But in the context of our discussion about the fuller explanation and revelation of God's name to Moses in Exodus 6:3, how that relates to Exodus 3, and how that relates even further back to how God said he would be made known as God to them, Abraham's seed, Genesis 17. So Harris says, if the name may not have any etymological connection with the verb, right? So that's what I'm talking about. When I say there's really no reason to look for this connection, there's no other indication that, oh, this is how the divine name relates to echye. No, there's nothing like that. It's just the verb used in the context of describing how Jaho is going to be with Moses and the Israelites. The sign. Right? Now, if you want to try to argue that it's related to the same verb that is based on the divine name, or the divine name may be based on, you have to show that further because it's not made plain in the context. As I said, when referencing other texts, we know, where text will sometimes say, this name means this because this, right? That's not how Exodus 3 describes the name or says it means this in relation to echye or echye, asher, echye. And so that's what Harris says right here. Why base anything on it if the name may not have any connection with it at all? That's what I'm talking about. There's no indication that there's a connection outside of the verb's use in this context that people are then connecting with the divine name and saying, oh, it must be pronounced that way because it's related to this verb. They're assuming that. They're not showing that's the case. There's no other evidence that shows that's how they pronounce the name, so that then they could say, oh, look, the way I did on that chart a moment ago when I was scrolling through my chapter 1. Oh, look, all these forms of the divine name in Greek or other languages during these times show that this is how they pronounce the name. And so it's related to the same verb. No, none of that is the case. Harris, we ought to be delivered at last from the endless debate as to whether the name means be, create, will become, will be present. It may mean none of these things. As to the meaning, the name is explained in the entire Old Testament, including what? Exodus 6:3, Exodus 3. Everything Jaho says about his name is a part of his name and associated with it. Right? Is he the God of the living or the dead? He's the God of the living, right? We don't directly associate that with his name because it's not used in the context like that. It still becomes a part of our understanding of him, more so as God, but I'm using it as an example of how this can happen with the name. Right? And so he goes on. He is creator, redeemer, sovereign, holy, God of love, merciful, gracious, long-suffering. You'll find the name used in association with all these things in the Old Testament. All right, in the New Testament, we don't have the manuscript evidence that would show their frequent quotation of the Old Testament in ways that would then be referenceable the way I am the Old. So that's why I do it. And so you can see the connection with the divine name to so many things. It's just people focus on what is said in Exodus 3, and then they go to Exodus 6, our text reading, and then they say, well, this special understanding, it involved this revelation to Moses about how the divine name is pronounced Yahweh. It means he will be, because he tells Moses, I will be, and that's Ehyeh. That's not what it says. And that's not consistent with any other evidence. And so Harris concludes, the name is explained by the attributes of God revealed in his word, including what? Exodus 3, right? Genesis 17, I will be God to them. Your seed, Abraham. I'm making a covenant with you and your seed, but there's a way when I bring them into the entire land of Canaan, I will be God to them in a way that I'm not to you. And that's what he's doing in Exodus 3, Exodus 6, and in the explanation to Moses, who keeps asking him about it. What am I going to say? What am I going to tell them? What if they ask this? Well, here's what you say. Well, because when we're already past that, then we're going to be doing this. You'll be worshiping me here. You're worrying too much. But my name, memorial, forever, Jaho. I will be with you, and I will be with them. Okay? I'm going to be who I say I'm going to be. I will be who I will be. That's exactly what that says. It's a doubling up of what he just told Moses regarding the exact same thing, the sign of his presence. There's nothing that suggests an etymological relationship between the divine name and the sign of his presence. What he's going to do for them, and the way, like we showed also in Exodus 7, Pharaoh would come to know him, right? Yada, same as is used in Exodus 6:3, the way that Jaho said he made his name known to Moses. So the experience of what he says is going to happen becomes inseparable from who he is. Just like Harris is talking about right here. There are other quotes than what I was looking for, but Harris said enough to accent what I've been saying and what we already know is true. We'll read one more. This is from Charles Giannotti, The Meaning of the Divine Name, YHWH, BSOC 39. Many of us are familiar with this, but we'll read it one more time. God's manifestation to Israel is yet future at the time of the burning bush incident. This Ehyeh is God's promise that he will redeem the children of Israel. The people were in great need. They needed not so much to know the facts about God's character or that he was simply a covenant God present in their time of need, right? Like with Abraham. Right? These are all important, but he's pointing out that, like I said before, there are different contexts in which these facts about God's character become associated with his name. But right here, right, this manifestation at the time of the burning bush is different. It's even different according to what God said to Abraham about his seed and how he would be made known as God to them, the way he's explaining it to Moses as well, because that's what's happening. They needed not so much to know the facts about God's character or that he was simply a covenant God present in their time of need, but to be reassured that this God would meet them in their time of need, proving true his character and his promises. This, in fact, constitutes what God promised Moses in what? Exodus 3:12. The very text I keep referring to because it uses the same verb that's used in verse 14 twice, but it's first used to Moses directly before it's emphasized for the same reason. That's why he says right here, this constitutes what God promised to Moses in verse 12, namely, God would be present and working on Moses' behalf in the difficult task ahead. Surely nothing less would have encouraged Moses to go. Whatever the situation or need, God will become the solution to that need. And in this case, we already know, right? He's going to free them from Pharaoh. He made that plain in our reading right here. Now you will see what I will cause to occur respecting Pharaoh. Because by a strong hand he will send them away, and he will with a strong hand even throw them out of his land. That's what he's talking about. That's what he's been telling Moses about, is it not? Has he not been telling Moses in response to his continued questions and lack of faith, right? You're going to find out. You're not going to need to explain this because I will be with you. Moses said to the true God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? Same thing he starts out talking to Moses about in our first verse in Exodus 6. Moses is asking him about it right here, to which God responds, I will be with you, Ehyeh. This is the sign. And then he goes on to respond, as I already emphasized, the fact that the things Moses is asking about it's not even in his mind. You're already here on the mountain worshiping him, and that's how you're going to know. Right? So my point in going back to this is to show it's about what's going to happen. Right? He's telling him, you're going to find out who I am, what I'm about. Right? This is how they're going to know. These things you're worrying about, that's not how it's going to flow. Right? It's not going to be this, well, what about him and who is he and what's he, how could this be the case? We're enslaved. No. You're going to go in there with power. And I'm going to have someone speak for you because you lack that power. Even though I'm the one who makes your mouth, I'm going to send someone on your behalf. And this is how it's going to come about. Right? He's not going to want to send them out, and he's going to eventually throw you out. And they're going to see you're going to be worshiping me in this mountain. All of that is associated with the divine name. And what he's telling Moses, is it not? That does not mean, however, that Jehovah, the divine name, is related to the same verb that is used to explain how these things will come about. So my recommendation is for people who find others who believe in the pronunciation Yahweh, try to explain the linguistic evidence we have, the Greek transliterations that show, according to the chart that I referenced earlier, and that you can get for free. Try to show that the available evidence during the time when these things were being done indicates something different. It shows they were pronouncing the divine name in ways that do not reflect an etymological association with the same verb, that is the divine name, and Ehyeh. So we go with the evidence according to the pronunciation that is best, And we still associate all of these verbs and their implications in these and in other contexts with the divine name when the divine name is used with them. That does not require us to seek an etymological explanation so that we know how to pronounce the divine name. We already know that. We know it for sure with Jah, do we not? There's no controversy that I know of regarding it. Moses used it, the same one to whom the text says God made more clear, fully explained. That's the one who first used the name that we highlight and who we are and what we're about, even though that's not the only name we use, of course. We believe in Jahoah, use that probably more. Just comes out. But Jah is indisputable. Right? It keeps us from these debates and arguments with people who want to take our worship and holy treatment of his name and put it in an argument. They want us to debate over the name and fight over Jah. When we should be pronouncing it in the way that is best according to the evidence, not speculative theories of etymological associations, even if they're true, right? Be flying in the face of all the other evidence. But even if they're true, we don't put theories ahead of facts. Facts are, what were they pronouncing? Who says they were pronouncing it a certain way? During what time was that said? During what time were they pronouncing it that way? Oh, Yah, Yah-O, Yah-O-Yah, like other forms like that in my chart. Not Yahweh. Oh, okay. Then that's what we'll do, right? So, no, they don't often do that. They just go with that theory. It's in one sense kind of like evolution, right? They see little things that they think might be true, and then they build a theory, and then people start believing that it's true when it's just a theory, right? There's no real evidence of what was said and how that would prove the theory correct. And all the evidence that proves what was said proves the theory incorrect, right? It's just like it. So we need to know these things. We need to be prepared to explain what it means in Exodus 6:3. The Jahoah made more clear, fully explained his name to Moses in ways he had not done to Abraham, who already knew the name, right? He knew the name. He used it, called on it, built altars to it. But not in the way that the fulfillment of the promise that was made to him was made known to Moses and those who were the fulfillment of the promise made through Abraham, that they would take possession of the entire land of Canaan, that God would prove to be with them, just like he's telling Moses, which would be the sign that everything he's telling them is going to come true. This is the time, right? No more lingering in slavery and being oppressed by the Egyptians. This is it. We're going home. We're going to that home you've been told about that was promised to your ancestors, and that this God, Jahoah, we know the name. We don't know the name yet. We're in slavery. Jahoah, what did that mean to them when they were in slavery? Do you think it means or meant the same thing it came to mean and meant to Moses and the Hebrews after they were freed? No way. Right? When they're in slavery, what does Jahoah mean to them? Probably not much, right? That's kind of the problem with Moses going back. So that's what he's talking about. He became known to them in a way different from Abraham. Right? Abraham didn't have to go through that. Say he went to Egypt, right? He had to get out of there in a difficult spot, but he did. It wasn't like now. No, this is different, right? Jahoah went down, saw the mistreatment. Now he's going to turn things around. Now he's going to reveal his name to them in a way that was not true before now. He's going to be with them, and they're never going to forget everything that takes place. And what's the name that they use after everything takes place? Jah.